bit lighter that we have. And well, while we go through each of these, also becoming very relevant in the current. So we'll start that. Just give another couple of minutes. We'll just wait. Okay, I started the recording, I guess. Yeah, I think I've started the recording. So let me share my screen and we'll start the session. So today's session we're gonna do is we will be taking the topic on data handling ethics, which is also the second chapter as part of the DM book. Now, this chapter, though it is more about ethics, but you'll see some of the other components getting discussed, which is more on the privacy, responsibility. You have some regulations getting covered as part of this, right? So that is, how ethically, how responsibly you need every one of us play a very ethical role with respect to data. So that is what speaks about. And the weightage of this chapter is around 2%, so uh, obviously, again, this is one chapter where you looking at the options and all, you would be able to answer it because you know what is something that is going to be there as part of it, right? So some of these components which will be there, right? So in very simple terms, I mean, all of you will understand this is more about ethics or the principles that people would be looking. So if you see in this word cloud, these are some of these keywords that you will be looking into this entire chapter. Like for example, fairness, respect, responsibility, integrity, equality, reliability, transparency, trust. So these are all like the ethical principles that have been discussed here. And it also speaks about how you would be procuring your data, storing the data, managing your data, using the data, disposing the data, right? So all of this together will say, so handling the data in a more ethical way. And, so this is more like a beam, as you can understand. You need to understand, which is, a lot of times when it comes to in an organization, if you see, like you have the marketing teams and all. Now, at one side of the you have your sales targets and you have some of these things. And a very good example that I always take is the Facebook example, which, couple 2014 when Facebook basically went hand in hand with Cambridge Analytica, if you all remember. At that time where the profiles of Facebook profiles of people were being shared with Cambridge Analytica for some, so right. So even though it was being done, but the consent of the people was not taken, and then there was social implications because the social campaigns were being run for the US elections, and targeted campaigns were being run, and then the people got influenced because of those campaigns, and a lot of that resulted in the person winning the the elections. So there was huge fines. So one thing that you'll see, there was on one side we wanted to monetize out the data that I have, but at the same time, what was the problem? That was the unethical data handling led into the loss of reputation. Facebook had to, Mark Zuckerberg had to come out and apologize, So there was a huge brand loss, reputation loss. The how it went down, the stock prices and all crashed. Adani is a very good example. You saw how the entire Heidelberg report came out and exposed. So a lot of times where data, and all of these are good data example, data, scenarios or data examples from the industry where you see that the organization have thought of going that extra mile of, using their data sets for monetization, but then it backfired back on them, right? So that was some of these things. Now, some of these, as you can see, the entire thing that the chapter will keep on having is the ideas that I was mentioning, the fairness, respect, responsibility, integrity, equality, reliability. So these are some of the key ideas that you will see, the 7 example ideas on these ethical principles. So there could be a question around that what are the ideas, ethical principles that has been looked into. Then ethical principles according to DM Bob. So that is what they defined, how they define data handling ethics. is more with respect to the procuring, the storing, managing, interpreting, analyze the entire life cycle of the data. So that should be aligned with the ethical principles. Right. So there are certain kind of, if you remember from the previous session, I mentioned about the context diagram. So in the context diagram perspective, you'll see that the definition that has been mentioned, you now will be able to remember it very easily looking at this diagram, because I know that diagrammatic representation you'll be able to remember. So the entire life cycle has to be an ethical. So there is a kind of a responsibility within the data community as a data professional you will have to have. Now, there are four reasons why Dama says that data handling ethics are important, right? So, again, there are questions around this. So that's the reason you will see. One of the other thing is like for the long-term success of the entire organization, so it is not like it is only for short-term kind of a perspective. This is more of a long-term goal that it looks into. As I was mentioning, loss of reputation coming up in that, unethical practices might be illegal, and there was also a social responsibility as each of us would be having. Then you'll see that there are three core concepts, ethics of data handling, core concepts that are being centered on. First is what is the impact of people? Since data is also representing the characteristics, or there is a lot of individuals or customers data that is there, so it also affects the people's lives. The Facebook example, as I mentioned, the social, their personal details, their personal emotions that they normally share on a social media website, everything gets impacted. So that is one thing. It also impacts everyone, like for example, I'll tell you, if I raise, if I slightly increase the interest rates, you see how much impact if people have on it. Or if the, sorry, I think I went on mute. Okay. You can use the Q&A for writing your questions. Yeah, there are some questions. Okay. You can keep on typing. I will have a look at them as well go forward. So one is the impact on people. As I was mentioning, people, largely everyone gets impacted because of if the data is not handled well. There is also one second core concept which Dama mentions, which is on the potential for misuse. So misusing the data can impact people, affect organizations, people, everyone. So there is an ethical imperative that you need to have so that you can start preventing the misuse of data. Then the other aspect is the economic value of the data. So data also, as you know, has a very high economic value. Now, that's the reason, when you start with your data organization, in your organization data, any of your data initiatives, the data ownership, primarily the value of the data, these are key things that you will be able to see around it. Right. Now, which one of these goals is not in the DMBOK as a business driver, right? So if you see, again, in DMBOK's perspective, there are certain concepts that it might be coming up that they might start asking you around it. So out of these options, one option that you will, you would be able to see, which is defining, educating, culturing, and then you have these component which is more about automating, right? So it says automating is not one of the thing which is completely mandated, because a lot of these things could be done manually as well, right? So that is one other thing that sometimes they ask questions around it. Now, name at least three of the six inputs that are being required to define data ethical things. Now, what are the inputs? Now, this question is coming from the context diagram, right? So if you see the inputs that are there is one is what are your organizational ethics, existing and preferred organizational ethics, which will be there. What is your overall business strategy and goals that an organization, the business has defined, the organizational structure that you're defining, the business culture that is coming in, what are the different regulations that are surrounding you, what are the existing corporate policies that could be taken, that internally you might have defined. So these are, when you are defining your data handling ethics, these are some of the inputs that feeds into your, data handling ethical policies that you will be defining around. Then what are the six core activities, right? So as I mentioned in the previous session, these activities are also classified into planning, doing, planning, controlling, development, and operations. Your PCDA, PCDO primarily, these are primarily been defined. So you're reviewing your data handling practices is more on your planning, right? So you have the planning, this is where you're trying to handling the data handling aspects. Then the identifying the principal practices, and again, this is an identification. So again, this is part of the planning phase. Then creating an ethical data handling strategy, that's the next step, which is more as part of your designing when you're trying to create or develop, right? You're developing an ethical data handling strategy. And then you're also trying to address the practice gaps which are there. So this is again, you're developing, right? Then what you're doing, you're communicating and educating the staff, right? This is where you're doing a lot of uh, kind of, you can say, again, you're designing and development, a lot of these things, you're communicating things. And this is also part of your operations where you want to do and operate part of it. And then monitoring and maintain the alignment is more of the control aspects. So that way, these activities that are part of your data handling ethics, where you first review your handling practices existing, identifying your existing principles, practices, and what are the existing risk factors, right? So there are multiple templates. Though Dharma doesn't give directly any templates, but there are a lot of templates which are available. Organizations have defined and designed it according to their some things you might get which other organizations are also use. You can leverage that as well. Address the practice gaps is more now you understood what are the gaps, existing gaps which are there in your organization. Then what you can do is you can start, creating the entire work plan and then start working on bridging those. Then communicating and educating the staff, right? So where this is again very much important, your the learning, training, enablement, and ensuring that people are following, people are able to make use of the initiatives, right? So that is your monitoring and maintaining alignment as well, where you are trying to control. So this, even though it is coming off as a single slide here, you will see this in the context diagram that has. Now, name at least 5 of the 9 deliverables that the DMBOK recommends, right? Now, what are some of the deliverables that has been mentioned in the context diagram? Is first is you document. So here what we have done is we were handling the reviewing, right, and identifying this. So you create a current practice and gaps document. You defined a strategy, data handling, ethical data handling strategy. Now, this data handling strategy, as we have seen these principles, right, to your entire life cycle, you basically identify all of it. You say what are the some things that is can be done and what are some of the things that cannot be done. Like for example, I'll say we have something called as data contracts, right? So data contracts is, let's say, for example, you have some vendors, with whom the data is getting shared and all. Now, as part of that policy, you normally always have to say that, there should be proper NDAs that has to be signed, how the vendors is storing, the data sets, what are the necessary controls that is there, or the vendors have to be certified from on certain data principles, or you have the payment card industry. So let's say, for example, the you are doing kind of credit card transactions with a third party. Normally in fintech companies, as you see, the customer's data, sometimes is being for that completing the transaction, you see those things. But how the companies are basically storing the data and those kind of things. So these are basically based on the industry, based on the contracts that you can define the strategy around it. Then you have the communication plan. There has to be a clear communication plan that normally you will have with your internal stakeholders as well as with your external stakeholders. A lot of times you take help from your legal teams, right? So internal legal teams are there who does a lot of these contracts. Sometimes, and you might be using help with help of your internal communications team, corporate communications, internal communications team who will send out these communications with respect to these are some of the new policies, new strategies that we have brought. Then you do the training programs, which I was mentioning. You write, you develop LMS modules, so, making people aware of what are some of the do's and what are the don'ts. Normally, every organization you see there are mandatory trainings that people they need to complete, right? So this is part again, you incorporate that. Then ethical corporate statements on data. So one of the other aspects is, you now see a lot of these companies have come up with their privacy policies, right? Every organization, if you go to their website, you will see that there is a privacy notice, there is a privacy policy, and sometimes you all of the websites they also have something called as cookie management, right? Where they say that okay, whatever the activities that you do, or the recommendations that we want to start saying. So, what are some of these ethical controls, uh, corporate statements that we would be making, which is more at a global level with respect to the organization, which everyone is able to aware. Awareness to ethical data issues, what are the, I will create awareness about what are the regulatory fines or what are some of the things which people should be doing or not, and what are the rather implications. Normally, if you see, some of the times the organizations are very strict about it. There are employees who have lost their jobs as well. There have been, actions that have been taken against them, strict corporate, because they went out in the open, they disclosed some of the internal secrets about the organization. Sometimes it happens that you're not very sure that it might be a kind of a thing, but you upload something on the social media websites and all. So organizations now have very strict controls around that. You might be seeing. Then what are the allied incentives, KPIs, and targets? You define that sometimes, for measuring some of these, each of these aspects. Then, what are the updated policies, ethical data handling, reporting, you create reports and dashboards? So again, these are part of some of the things. There is nothing like a standard things. Every organizations have created this over the years. That primarily based on whatever the KPIs that are important for them, they start documenting, listing down them, and accordingly they start creating them. Now, what are the six stakeholders? Again, what are from a stakeholders perspective, what are the people who are important as part of it? So here you will see that there are different set of stakeholders, right? So one side of stakeholders that you see would be your suppliers. On the other side, you will see the other participants, which are nothing but your participants. And you have the other set of people who are involved, that is nothing but your consumers, right? From suppliers' perspective, there would be people like executives. So suppliers are primarily who would be supplying these necessary information. So you have the management board, you have the data stewards, you have the executive data stewards, you have the IT team who would be providing a lot of this information, data providers, right? So all of them are the suppliers of these data or suppliers of this necessary details that would be required for you. Participants would be like your CDO, Chief Data Officer, CIOs. You have the data governance office part of it. You have the people, the working group stewards, data stewards, who are the people who are on the ground and doing a lot of these things. You have the subject matter experts, right? So these are all the people who would be uh, coming on the participant side, and on the consumer side, who are the people who would be getting consuming. So these are nothing but your employees who will be getting benefited. Then you have the regulators, right? Because sometimes the regulators might be asking you to do this, and then you might have to give this information to the regulators. And then you have the management board, right? The board of directors, the management board. Uh, yeah. So these are the people whom you have to report. So they are also the executives, the CXOs and who are the part of it. So this is, you will see the different stakeholders as part of the data ethics journey. And you will see the different activities, so as part of these activities, as you can see, these people, data governance bodies. So I've listed it over here. So these people who are in the activities are nothing but the participants. And then these are the key stakeholders who are nothing but your consumers. Okay. Now, another thing that comes is list four core techniques and tools used as a technical drivers for data ethical. Yeah, so there are two components. One is your business drivers, and next is your technical drivers, right? So, business drivers primarily, if you see, if you remember Deming, Edward Deming. So Deming primarily mentioned that uh, we whenever we do the things right, that is something that is we will have to ensure that this is done the right way in the first go itself, or it has to be done ethically. Whatever we are doing, it has to be done ethically, right? So ethical is something data handling has been always being associated. Now, initially, ethical was more with respect to ensuring the trustworthiness, right? So ethics, and whenever you start trusting the data, what are the outcomes that is coming up? What is the organization, the stakeholders, the relationships, right? That ethical culture has to be defined. So how do you basically put in the necessary, governance in place, controls in place? So that is more about the ethical handling of the data that was being. Initially, it was more with respect to the quality, ensuring the trust in the data. So these were some of the things, but as over the time, these have been identified specifically with this to some of these, right? So if you see this entire data initiatives are now part of your entire CRO's agenda, right? Your chief risk officer, because now data leakages, data, all of these challenges, this is nothing but your risk. So I've worked with multiple organizations. I've seen that all your data office, whether it's your data office, you see. So normally your CRO, your chief risk officer, takes care about your risk like credit risk, market risk, right? You have operational risk, right? So these are one of the different types of categories of risk, right? Credit, market, operational, some other risks will be there, which are more on the financial side, financial risk you can consider. And these are the non-financial risk, right? So for example, security office, the entire security of the organization, which could be a risk for the organization, right? So within that, now under the security office, you have something called as a data security, right? Data security or security of the data, which is a subset of your security office. And again, the data office, which is again is one more about, right? So the governance office also you'll see could be some organizations keep it under your CRO's bucket, because again it's a risk. And then within the CRO, you will have someone like a chief data officer, a chief data privacy officer, DPO, data protection officer, you call. And so these are mostly the peoples you will find. You have the data security officer, DSO, or the CISO, the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer. So these are all part of it. Sometimes organizations they keep this entire unit as separately. So they report to the board directly. So that is also another kind of an org structure that you will be seeing. So again, different organizations, because obviously you require someone to oversee this entire thing. Sometimes they put it under CRO's responsibility, core responsibility area. Sometimes the board directly would like to have it, the chief data officer or the CISO directly reporting to them. These are different things you will see. So these are the core technical drivers that you will be able to see as part of the entire component. So you will have the analytics statements of formation, communications plan checklist, the wikis, knowledge bases and all, right? So tools and techniques. So this is again coming from the context diagram. What are the different types of metrics that you can use? So like for example, from a training perspective, you can consider one metric will be the number of trainings that you can take in, right? So that could be one metric. How many people have completed the trainings? What is the average score? Then the compliance versus non-compliance incidents, right? Then you have the whistleblower policies, right? So the entire this is again very much important, the whistleblower policy coming up and whether people are aware about all of this, because the incident that happened in Facebook's example also was nothing but a whistleblower policy. There was a whistleblower who went out and, they exposed Facebook that this is something that is happening. And normally, time and again, you'll see that whenever some of these scams or some of these, large things that comes out in the open, it is mostly because of some whistleblower coming up and exposing these organizations about their wrongdoings, right? So which is not ethically, the organizations are not doing ethically right. So people will come out and try to, not go with that same flow, but basically try to oppose it. So you'll see that these are different types of metrics. As I was mentioning, the compliance incidents, the number of employees trained, what are the executives in, involvement in this overall aspect. Now, what are the two assumptions that often lead to the organization to fail at data ethics and the trends that make it more important to succeed? Again, there are two main assumptions that are being considered. One is the organizations are continuously using newer ways and methods, So as you can see, uh, the legislation cannot keep up with this evolving environment. So, sometimes you'll see that the innovations goes at a very so rapid pace the corresponding regulations might take some time to come in place, So we will just mention at a very high level. But now, if you see data sharing that was happening and lot, India came out with the Digital Data Protection Act after so many years. Telecom, since 2005, I know that the data was being used by misused by different organizations. The way that it was being handled, a lot of organized people were, concerned about the privacy of their data. But India came out somewhere last year, with that act. So it takes so much years. So that is one of the key problems that you will see with respect to data ethics, that the technicians profess not to understand the data and assume follow the letter of the law is at no risk. So sometimes there is also a kind of a gap between what is the regulation, what is something that we need to do and what we don't need to do, right? So sometimes the professionals are not there, Again, some of these regulations and all, they keep it a little wide open, subject to interpretations, and then people they understand it based on what based on their level of understanding and maturity, and then you see that sometimes everyone is not at the same maturity or doing the same things in the right way. So these are some of the uh, the failures that you'll see within the organization or these regulations, because they are not very detailed. Very few regulations that you will feel is very detailed, mention timelines, mention the exit criterias and entry criterias very clearly. So that is again what is just mentioning. What are the key five business drivers, the three opportunities and threats that motivate a data ethics problem? So this is again, you know, you'll see what are the three things is. First is to increase the trustworthiness, improve the relationships and stakeholders, expect ethical behavior. These are the most three opportunities that you can think about. And what are two threats is, first is to reduce the organizational risk that we have, and second is to secure the data from criminals, right? So there are three opportunities that you will find. These are primarily the business drivers, as I was mentioning. So these are three. So from there's a entire 4 to 5 paragraphs, but out of that, this is the entire key summary that you can bring in. So first is increase the trustworthiness in the data, improve the relationships between the stakeholders, and also everyone as part of their entire data journey expects a very ethical behavior. Two threats which are there is, first I want to reduce the organizational risk, and second is that I want to secure the data from different criminals. Now list the 6 groups of essential concepts for data ethics. So first is the ethical principles of data. Now within the ethical principles of data, we'll take each of them, right? So what are the three different ethical principles? One is, so these principles that you can consider across the different, industries they have been used. Now there is in what the book mentioned is in medical research perspective, you have something called as Belmont principle. Okay. Now, this Belmont principles primarily is more with respect to the information management, right? I'm not from a medical background and all, so I'm not aware much of the Belmont principles. But what is it mentions is a respect for persons. So if you know, there is a regulation which is the HIPAA regulation, which is your health information privacy of data, for the patient-related information related data, which is the HIPAA, which is there in the US. So when it mentions is the respect for persons, where it mentions that the fundamental ethical requirement that people which should be treated in a way which is more with respect to respecting the dignity of these each of these individuals, right? So it is not like we should be always trying to protect their dignity and whatever the rights is, so that everyone should be respected. The personal data is something that has to be taken utmost care of. Even the patient related information that we might be collecting is something which is very sensitive. If you see, people are very, like for example, if I'm having some of a disease, I don't want everyone to know it, right? And then the hospital is going can go and share this, and then people start reaching out to me that you have this disease, we have medicine for you. So this was some of the incidents that was happening, because of which this HIPAA regulation started coming in, right? So one is the respect for people, one of the ethical principles. Second is beneficence, which has again two elements. So let me just list it down. So beneficence, if you see, will have two parts. First is you do not harm anyone. And second is how you can maximize the benefits which are individuals are having, and you try to minimize the possible harms. So first thing is you should not harm at all. You should try to, have something that the data collections or any of your practices should not harm anyone. Second is how you can start maximize the benefits and minimizing, the harm of the people, harm to the people, how that is possible. So, like for example, if your data handling is lacking any kind of a transparency, if the data processing that is happening in a very risky way, that could lead to data leakages, right? So those kind of things is where it speaks. So there is the second ethical principle. Third, it speaks about justice. So justice, as you all understand, yeah, that everyone is fair and everyone should be treated well or equal within under law, right? So if it's like a Facebook founder, it is not that they have the right to do things differently. So justice remains same for everyone, right? So everyone should be treated equally at all circumstances. We should also start seeing that, like for example, Cambridge Analytica might be using some kind of machine learning algorithms for using, right? So that bias, now all of you are connected with AI. So you see that some of these models have, cultural bias wise, like for example, you upload, this is something that I experienced with one of the models. We upload two, images of people where a person one was black and the another person was white, and then we asked that, is either of them, a convict, looks a, suspected criminal, and the person with the black skin was identified, yes, this looks like a, is like looking like a criminal. So the model is having like a bias, a cultural bias. So that should not be there, So that is again one of the things which is coming up under the data principles. Now, this is one thing. So there are different types of regulations that started coming up with respect to digital ethics, with respect to data ethics. So that is, how it was mentioned. Then the data principles are again behind the data privacy law. So different countries and geographies now have the different data privacy laws, right? Initially, these were all part of some of these different regulations. Like for example, just a minute. So, like for example, in the US, we have the US Privacy Act. Somewhere in 1974, it was there, which was speaking about the right of privacy, but it was not with respect to the right of privacy with respect to the data. So it was very broad. It was very, kind of kept open in that sense. And then we had the IT Act, of 2005, which also had some clauses with respect to the privacy, how the privacy of individuals, which was being looked into. But then again, it was not very. So over the time, you'll see that different regulations have matured. Some in 1980, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, they defined certain principles on fair information processing and all. But again, that was primarily all these regulations they were taken into consideration when the European data protection laws, the GDPRs and all, they started coming up as part of it, right? Now, what are some of these principles which are there? So we'll spend some time in understanding what are the principles as part of the entire um, of the GDPR principles which are there. So first is the fairness, lawfulness, and transparency, which is that the data should be processed lawfully, fairly, in very transparent manner. That is the first principle. Second is the purpose limitation. So a lot of times you'll see that the person who is collecting the data will give you forms which runs into like 7, 8 pages. But is it like all so much data is required? Everyone has a principle that let's collect the data. We'll see later, what needs to, whether it's actually required and all. So there is a purpose limitation, which is that whatever you're collecting should be having a specific purpose and should be making sense in why we are collecting, right? So that's the second principle. Third is the data minimization, where you say that whatever we are collecting, is it like bare minimum? That each of these principles that we have, rather than collecting all of them, just for the sake of, can we minimize that 7 to 8 pages into a single page, one page, with only the essential details that are required. And later details we can collect it later stage when it is required at a for a specific purpose. Then the accuracy, the data that is being collected needs to be accurate, needs to be kept up to date. So all of it is something again, one of the other important principle that you'll see in GDPR mentioned. Storage limitation. So you'll see that the portability of the data is also one of the very important aspect where the storage should be in such a way that we should be able to limit the storage requirements which are there. Then integrity, confidentiality being one of the other important aspect in such a way that the data should be that it should be confidentially stored. It should be stored for a specific, specific purpose. It should there. Then what are the necessary controls that we are taking into consideration in case if there is an accidental loss, if there is a destruction of damage that is coming up, right? And the last principle being is the data accountability. So that is anyways as part of your data governance when you are setting up your organization structures and all, the ownerships and the accountability has to be very clearly uh, taken into consideration. So that gets extended to the GDPR principles as well. And then over the other principles that comes in, right? So we have something called as privacy by design and privacy by default. So privacy by design is like, privacy is as a very important aspect that should basically start right from the point when you're designing any systems. So when you're designing any kind of a system, so across each of the stage when you're designing, right from the, ideation phase and all, so data privacy has to be put into. So any of the new products, any kind of models that you're creating, so that is right from the design stage, it has to be there. And privacy by default is primarily any of your policies, uh, any of your these aspects like the contracts as I was mentioning, contracts or any of the agreements, any of the initiatives that you want to take, you will see that privacy by default has to be part of it. By default, privacy as an element comes in, just like we take security as an element always, so any initiatives, anything that you see. So security by default is definitely there. But that is where now we also have to put in privacy by design and privacy by default into the entire, development phases. So you will see that different regulations have focused on some of these different aspects. Like for example, you have the Canadian privacy law. They mentioned that the which is also the Personal Information Protection on Electronics Documents Act. They primarily again mentions a very similar thing that across your entire life cycle of the personal data of the how you are handling the personal data of these individuals, then how you're handling the complaints, for people from the people, which we also called as the risk registers. Normally we have these risk registers data. Um, in privacy terminologies, we have these, incident management teams or the risk managements. Like if they see some of these things, the complaints that is there, so you should have all these things. Then you have some of these individuals who will come up with their data subjects rights request. So like I want to know whether my data, how is my data being there. So every individual who is sharing this data also has certain kind of rights. So these are nothing but your data subject rights, right? So I will want, just like you have these, we have something called as the RTI, right? Right to information, right? So that right to information is nothing, is very similar to this. We have as a data subjects, we have certain kind of rights. So that is where you will see those kind of things coming up in this aspect, right? So, so what is entailing in creating an ethical culture? We have the governance, controls, ethical outcomes that is come. So these are the key main things that would be part of it. How does data ownership influence the data handling ethics? So you have improved technology, ease of data sharing, that is another aspect. These are all coming in from the book, what the book mentions, and normally the questions that comes in, is very much the options that you will see will be around them as well. The ethics of sharing the data, and others' data as well. Five emerging roles within. So these are again the chief data officer, risk officer, privacy officer, analytics officer that we have mentioned there. So yeah, so we were mentioning about these bioethics. But respect for persons, beneficent justice, I've covered this. You have the European Data Protection Supervisor Four Pillars. So future EDPS is the European Data Protection Act, which is there. So that is what are the four main pillars that is here? The future-oriented regulation, it is accountable controllers, privacy conscious, and then empower individuals. These are the four main pillars. Seven principles of GDPR that I was mentioning: lawfulness, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity, accountability, confidentiality, and accountability. These are your seven principles. At least five of the 10 statutory obligations of the Canadian privacy law, which is the PIPEDA, which I was mentioning around them. So you'll see some of these, there would be overlaps, right? Like, for example, you saw accountability being there in your GDPR as well. You have consent was not specifically, but you have consent management, you have consent that is very much there. So there would be overlaps between them. So this is again with respect to the Canadian Privacy Law, PIPDA, which is where you have accountability, identifying the purpose, consent from the individuals or the data subjects. You have limiting the collection, the use, disclosure, and retention, accuracy, safeguards, openness, individual access, compliance challenges coming in. Then what are the five fair information technology, the fair information processing principles? Now, this is primarily the US Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. They issued a report which were recommending a lot of these organizational designs and what they need to bring in to implement their privacy programs. So this is the part of the privacy by design. So one is the notice or the awareness for the people is one of the thing that we should have. Then we should have a kind of a we should be giving a kind of a choice to the consumers, whether they want to opt in or whether they want to opt out, or they should be able to provide some kind of a consent. Then we should be also providing them access and participation. So these consumers should be able to view and contest accuracy and completeness of the data that has been collected, right? So people should be able to certify that what is being collected is correct. Then the security aspect. So what kind of reasonable steps we as a data collector who are collecting, we should be able to make that the data is being accurate and secured. Then what kind of necessary, principles that we are imposing, sanctions that we are putting in, what we are enforcing for non-compliances, right? So these kind of principles that we are putting. Now there are other types of additional FTC areas which FTC has mentioned with respect to the OECD's Fair Information Processing Guidelines. So first is the simplification of the consumer choice. Then the recommendation that we should have to maintain comprehensive data management procedure throughout the entire information lifecycle. Then we have a do not track option that do not track. If I don't want my data to be tracked, right? So now again, a lot of these times when we have rights, then again, you have a counter rights also where, if there is something that is very much essential or necessary, that I feel that you are more of a suspicious kind of a person, then some of these, there are other regulations that, oversee or they can basically override the existing some of these things. Like in DPDP, you have something. If the government wants you find you very much suspicious and they want to track, then, even though you have a right some of these things, but you see that for the national security perspective, do have the right to oversee some of them. Then requirements for affirmative express consent. Then we have the concerns regarding the data collection capabilities, individual access to the data, educating the individuals about the different privacy practices, and then we have the privacy by design, some of these things. Now, identify a global trend affecting the privacy, information privacy. So you'll see that there are different types of these different aspects will starts coming up. The principles around. So this was more about with respect to these different trends with different privacy regulations coming in. One of the trend that you can see is now inter-country regulations are coming. Like for example, you have the European Union and US coming up with their Privacy Act, which is more about the cross-border transfers, right? So like this, you will now find regional privacy laws coming in. Now, most of the national laws are already there, but now when data sharing has to happen between different countries, so you see the between European Union and US, there is an act, which is the European Union US Act, which is focusing more on the data privacy between these, sharing between them. So like this, you will see that's a kind of a trend that is happening, in the risk domain and the privacy domain. Then there are online emerging dozens of initiatives that have come in. So some of these topics, that is one is the ownership of data. I think all of we understand now with respect to organization structures and ownerships. Everyone has a kind of a responsibility and ownership assigned. Then we have the right to be forgotten, So like as a consumer, I can request my data to be deleted, right? So that is again one of the key principles that I am having where I can be I at any point in time want my data to be deleted. So that is one thing. Then next is the identity, where I am having the right to identify and correct my identity, right? So if I want to have a private identity, like for example, in LinkedIn, you see the post that we are putting, you know, can I want it to be posted with everyone? Can I want it to be posted with a specific group of people? Can it want to be posted only with myself? I don't it want to be publicly typed. So then that identity of each of these posts you can see has been segregated in this way, right? So that is one thing. And then speech of freedom of speech online where I can start expressing my opinion. I can basically uh, some of these things, um, you should not basically bully someone, you should not troll someone, you should not insult someone. You should basically express some of your opinions in a more constructive way so that basically people know some of your reviews and all of this. So that's again one of the things. Now, six unethical data handling practices. So primarily, there are different ways. This is again come from a book. They adopted how to lie with statistics. That is primarily. So here there are different, ethical data handling ways that they mentioned. One is the timing. So what is the timing that, with respect to the data that is like that timing plays a very important role. Now, primarily in the case of, reportings in the form of analytics, you'll see the market timing, the reports that you might be getting at a point in time. So that is one of the very important aspect. So even business intelligence people, like for example, just you want the stocks in the stock market. This is very much a very good example. Whether can I start getting data before someone else based on which I can start placing my deals. And you know this because a lot of these scams that has happened is more where there were insider informations that were getting circulated, and based on that I was able to make in things. If you know financial crimes, a lot of these financial crimes and scams has happened where, I was having an advantage as compared to other traders. I was able to make calls, right? So timing plays a very important role. So this is again one of the unethical way, everyone should be in the same level. Otherwise, you'll see that it's not like a fair game, right? I am giving an important. Then misleading visualization, very important, right? So you see an organization showing that stock prices, charts, everything very strong, and then you see they are actually, going bankrupt. So that is again, you see some of these things where you start tricking people, start creating visualizations in such a way that, the visualization is something, but the underlying data is actually completely different, right? So that is another unethical way. Unclear definitions or comparisons. You see, one of the other important aspect is the definitions and all is very not very clear. So, like for example, you in your reports and all, what you are reporting, might people might think, oh, my reports look very strong, but how you have defined it is something which is, there might be some underlying, hidden truths within it which you are not clearly disclosing. So that is another unethical way. Then bias. One of the other important aspect is bias. Everyone not keeping everyone at the same level, right? So different across your different life cycles. And now with AI, bias is something which is very much there. How your model is trying to give and introduce a bias as part of the output. So there is a very important focus on bias these days with because AI models and all is very you see start hallucinating, they start providing different outputs, the deviation that is coming in from the expected outputs, right? So that's your bias, right? So that should not be there, the output. So one of the ethical principle is all about bias also, that it should not be unbiased. Or yeah, it should be unbiased, it should not be having any kind of bias. So the sample that you're selecting or right from the point where the data that you're collecting, each of these areas or the search or the outputs that you're coming in, all of it should not having any kind of bias. Then transforming and integrating the data, right? So as part of the data origination, data lineage, the data quality aspects and all, that is also some of the things, the metadata that is being captured is unreliable, documentations are missing. So these are the things might also start creating a lot of these unethical data handling aspects. Then obfuscation and redaction is primarily where now the entire data anonymization, data masking, sensitive data information that is there, how you can start putting these security controls. That is one of the important aspects. So normally your security office will start taking it, that you start masking the data, you start marking the data, like which of these data, you're adding tags like confidential data, personal data, so you start doing data classifications. Right. So these are some of the things that is also very much important as part of this. So these are the six analytical data handling practices you can think of that has been mentioned. And then these are some of the examples that you can see. So as you can see, of each of these, the visualizations might be creating unclear definitions. Well, it might looking at it. Sometimes it happens, that what has been shown to you, there is a lot of hidden truth because we have not went into understanding the details around it. Five different types of bias collection, data collection. So these you can look into it later. I've explained it, each of these. Yeah, and this is on the data obfuscation reduction. Now, for establishing defining a process that moves an organization towards and establishing a data culture. So this is the entire process that you can see. What you do is firstly you review your current data state handling practices. Your current understanding the current state is very much important. What is your current ethical practices? What are the drivers that is there? Then basically you start reviewing some of these things. Now you also start understanding what are your existing employees' understanding across each of these, right? So that's the first thing that you do. Second is you identify the principles, practices, and what are the risk factors, right? So one of the other important aspect is that what are your principles that you're defining, right? Now, some organizations, as you see very clearly, there are code of conducts that they mentioned. There are certain kind of, principles that they very clearly they cannot go, ahead with, and they have set examples time and again. If people have breached those, there is nothing like anyone could be has been less, not even, people. If you remember Cognizance employees, or I remember there was an incident where, this very senior person, even the CEO was accused by someone, so it is not like anyone could be left out. So in case if on the data aspects also, on the data principles also, if we can mention some of these things, then start seeing, what are the guiding principles, what are the risk, what is the practice, what is the control that we start putting in. Third is the creating the ethical data handling strategy. So within that, you define what are the value statements, you define the truth, fairness, justice principles, you define the ethical data handling principles as part of it. You bring in some kind of a compliance frameworks which are there. A lot of these frameworks are important because sometimes within your organization, people are not ready to accept all of your these initiatives, data initiatives. It is very difficult, trust me, I have done it myself. It is not very easy. But when you start bringing a lot of these compliance frameworks, that this has been mandated by the government. This is otherwise there is a fine. So when you start bringing this fear factor within them, you start seeing a lot of these approval starts coming up, starts falling in place and all. So that is one of the things. You start doing the risk assessment, start doing training communications, and then start creating the roadmaps. And then adding a social responsibility right around it, like can I start, impacting the lives of people? Can I start aligning or, you know, touching this, or, you start bridging this along with some of your CSR initiatives? That's a very much important when you start bringing that CSR angle, right? So first thing, you always start thinking in that way when you start bringing a CSR or social responsibility angle to it. First is you get a lot of appreciation for that efforts. Second, you get a lot of support because CSR is mandated now in all organizations. So those are the other things that you can start saying. So these kind of things, and then you as a organization also start showing yourself socially, you know, aligned to some of your social practices. So that's again one of the few of the things that you'll start seeing. So here you can see, as you can see, the current state and documenting the ethical principles is there, the principal risk practice and control. I think you just can go through each of them in the context. Now, seven components of an ethical data handling strategy that you were able to see, right? The value statements, data handling principles, compliance frameworks that I spoke of. And then four risk areas of ethical data sampling project, identification, behavior capture. Yeah, so this is one thing, again, very important. They have a very ethical risk model, which is there, that has been shown also in the, you know, in the book, which is again very nice, which is being very nicely shown. So what are some of the ethical risks which might be there in a sampling project? So these ethical risks are primarily or divided into four types, you can say. So one is primarily your these aspects, which is your identification. You have something called as your the behavior capture part of it, analytics and data science and results, right? So this is what they have mentioned. And for each of these, you know, they have basically shown something which is so identification speaks about how these populations are being selected for the study. Behavior will speak about how the data has been captured. Then you also have the analytics and data science, where as in like what activities will the analytics just will focus on, and the results, underlying results coming up, right? So that is one thing. Now, what ethical risk of identification could be required ethical aspects, so that there could be questions around that. So here you can see the demographic requirements and the selection method. That is the two components that has been mentioned. Then the content that is required. So this is nothing but all coming from here. We have created separate slides for that. The behavior capture will require the content required, the capture method, the activities, the sentiment, the location, the date time combination, data sets, legal and ethical reviews, which is part of it. Then for BI data science analytics, you can think about profiling the prospects and actual and forecast activities, which is, and for distributing the results, you know, what are the privileges granted or denied, what are the further engagements or, you know, are involved, what are the relationships you want to remove the relationships or enhance the relationships, the benefits or the sanction, the trust or the lack of trust, bias treatments coming up, right? So this is all part of it. Now, at least two of the four examples how to use a disk model to execute, right? So you can see first is anonymizing the data, removing the private information, tightening the security, and reviewing the applicable privacy law. So what are the roles and responsibilities of oversight? As a question, if you see, on the data governance side, they will set the standards and policies and provide an oversight. Legal counsels, as I was mentioning, right? You might have to work with the legal team. So they will keep on verifying the contracts, what are the legal obligations, those aspects. And employees, everyone will have to start doing fair handling of the data, reporting any of your incidents and all, and not interfering in any of their principles. Five ethical obligations for members of Dharma. So this is again Dharma's code of ethics that is very much important. First is observe the Dharma's bylaws, because all of you will get now aligned with Dharma. So they will have to start applying and following the Dharma bylaws, practice the Dharma ethics and values. Educate others. That something that, as you can see myself doing, you become torch bearers for the next batches, and you start educating people, and then no harassments or bullying promotes the Dharma's image. So these are some of the ethicals. This comes as a favorite question of Dharma's code of ethics. So these are some of the things that you can see. At least three of the six additional ethical obligations for officers and advisors of Dharma. Again, this comes. Actively support the Dharma programs, not profit personally from my performance as an officer. Raise conflicts of interest to Dharma ethics officer. Conduct all Dharma business under its values and ethics. All Dharma communications are official on the record, and protect PI and do not distribute or sell it. Right. So there is something we also, every one of us have to start following practice. Okay. All right. I don't think we have much time. Let me just see if there is any questions in the chat window quickly, and we'll start taking those Q&A. You can start typing your questions. Any questions if you have? You can put it under the Q&A tab. You can see that there is a Q&A tab which is there. You can start using that. questions. This is again, the chapter is not very difficult. If you think what I spoke of is everything is what you need to do correctly and what you don't need to do. Right. So that's the only thing, that's the reason only 2% has been weightage given to this chapter. But again, you see this area as a whole is very much important these days because there are a lot of privacy regulations and all. So don't worry, you will not be tested on, um, any external regulation which has not been mentioned here, like Indian data protection or South African. You have Brazilian data protection, right? Which is your BEDS or something. I forgot the name. So Brazilian Data Protection Act, BIPS something, Information Protection Privacy Law something, which is again there. You will not be tested on that. Primarily, there are two regulations that they have mentioned, two or three. One is the GDPR, you have OECD, you have the Canadian Privacy Law. These are the three ones that they have mentioned very clearly. HIPAA, they have just mentioned the keyword, but not like in more detail. Okay. All right, cool. So any questions, you can type in the chat window or in the Q&A. What you can do is during the day also. So I think this chat window will be there. So what you can do is you can use this and can type in the questions. I can start answering during the day as well, if not now. Uh, okay, and I'll share this video recording of this video with all of you. Okay, so I think we'll connect in the next session then, if there's no questions. I hope you enjoyed today's session. I know it's a bit theoretical and some of these things are, but just as I was mentioning, go with the essence of it. Don't think too much. Okay, there's I think some Q&A. Yeah, okay, fine. I think that's good. Okay, I can see now. It is a cybersecurity responsive data going to monitor the data handling is happening, right? So see, what happens is, as I was mentioning, it is primarily cybersecurity's responsibility. Under cybersecurity, you have someone called as a data security office. So they normally take care about these data handling. And you have data security as a area itself is very broad because in data security, you have something called as your data leakage, DLP, you have data activity monitoring, you have data masking, encapsulation, anonymization, obfuscation, redaction, right? So all these are primarily a data security officer who basically take care of it. Um, or data, sometimes what happens is the data governance officer primarily sits, so in the under a data office, you have three main pillars. One is data security, we have data governance, you have data privacy, right? Sometimes data governance and privacy roles they are merged together, and sometimes you have all the data quality, all metadata, all these initiatives are under data governance. Sometimes data security normally they keep it separate because it rolls up to your uh, information security officer. Sometimes they keep both the units under the information. So different organizations have structured it differently. But data governance officer might also have someone like a data security officer, and the data security officer can report to the data governance officer also. So I've seen that kind of a modules also. Sometimes they want to keep it separate as a unit, or sometimes they basically, but data governance officer will not do the data security principles every, by all by himself or herself. They have someone as a data security officer who looks into the data security aspects. So they could be already a person in the cyber security team, information security team, or they could be might be have now been aligned under the data office as a whole. So those things is there, but data governance officer they keep it uh, as a parallel person or sometimes as an overarching person also. Also, different organizations have kept it differently. Hope it answers. But the responsibilities are different. So, roll up can happen, but um, that is there. They have different key roles and responsibilities for sure. Okay, all right, guys. So thank you. You guys have enjoy your Sunday. I will meet in the next session then, and I will share this recording and slide as well. Okay, sure. Thank you. Anything else if anyone has, you can ask. Okay, I'll stop the recording then.